Welcome to Super Thursday. Also known as day one of our 5th annual conference on America's role in the world. It's great to see so many of you out here early on a Thursday. We're really thrilled, and we're proud once again to convene this conference and to bring such a terrific group of IU scholars and scholars from elsewhere, policy practitioners, journalists, and activists together. It's a diverse group with different disciplinary backgrounds, different professional experiences, different life experiences, different points of view, and from different political parties. In short, it'll be an intellectual and inclusive 2 days. And it's a priority of this conference, and we're very proud to be able to do it, to make this a platform for real, intense intellectual debate together with different points of views in one room at one conference, something needed now more than ever. You've got programs in front of you, but I thought I would do a little annotation of each of the panels that we'll see. I won't say much about our first panel on climate change because our moderator, Emily Atkin, will do that. But we wanted to look at the issue of U.S. Public opinion and U.S. policy toward climate change, how it's changing, who the actors are, where the action is coming from, and where it's not coming from. Next up is a panel on national security challenges, what they are, what they might be, what constitutes a national security challenge in the global situation in which we find ourselves, where the United States is no longer the only big kid on the block. We'll then have a conversation with Ambassador William J. Burns, moderated by New York writer Susan Glasser. Bill Burns is the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and one of the country's most esteemed diplomats. And for a diplomat, he's written with uncharacteristic bluntness about the current state of the challenges to American foreign policy recently in The Atlantic and the New York and in Foreign Affairs magazine. He's also the author of a terrific new book, The Back Channel, which is on sale in our atrium over the course of the conference, together with books by many of our other panelists. Last month in the Atlantic piece I referred to, he wrote, "The power of our example, however much we may have exaggerated over the years, was always more important than the power of our preaching." Tomorrow begins with Senator Todd Young, the senior senator from this state, a graduate of IU and an increasingly influential member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, not to mention a former aide to Senator Luger. He's taken prominent positions on Saudi military operations and tactics in Yemen, on humanitarian aid, on the role of Congress in the authorization of the use of force, and he's been a big supporter of the importance of federal funding for education to deepen understanding of critical regions and deepen education in critical languages. And this university and many others are big beneficiaries of those programs. We'll also have a panel on presidential elections and U.S. foreign policy. How could we not? And then remarks by Ambassador Marie L. Jovanovic, the former ambassador to Ukraine, my former colleague at the Department of State. And if there can be a bright spot in something as polarizing as an impeachment hearing, it was to give the American public the chance to see the dignity, expertise, and steely professionalism of the people who work for the U.S. government. All of the panels will be here today and tomorrow, with the exception of Ambassador Jovanovic's, will be just across the way at the IU auditorium. So this conference has 3 aims. It's a conference principally for students. Of course, we're thrilled to have our faculty and community members here. Students introduce the panels. They are given priority for questions. There's a student op-ed contest, which will be judged by CBS 60 Minutes special correspondent Bill Whitaker, who will be on the elections panel tomorrow. And the students have organized a lunch, our GS7. Do we have students from the GS7 here today? Way to go. Our Global Student 7 organization, which advises me, has organized an informal student lunch. Last year it was over burritos and beans to exchange notes and compare and ask questions about careers, career paths, and the state of the world. It's a conference that is inspired by the ethos of our namesakes, Representative Lee Hamilton and Senator Richard Luger. Congressman Hamilton, as many of you in this room know, represented the Indiana 9th, this district, for 34 years. He rose to be chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and his advice was sought by presidents, Democrat and Republican, from Lyndon Johnson to Barack Obama. In his role in Congress and since, he built a reputation as a truth teller. And he would tell that truth irrespective of which party occupied the White House. And I can personally attest to that fact. But he tied that truth-telling to a reputation for fairness, trustworthiness, and a rare ability to build consensus. And that's why President Bush appointed him to serve as vice chair of the 9/11 Commission, helping to forge national unity at a time when that could not be assumed after the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. Throughout his career and now, Lee Hamilton takes Congress's role on matters of war and peace with the seriousness that the Constitution demands. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Congressman Hamilton for joining us and for his leadership in the school. And you'll get a chance to hear from him later on in his introduction of Bill Burns. This is our first conference without Senator Richard Luger, a gentle giant of foreign policy representing a pragmatic Midwestern commitment to globalism. He served as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and ranking member at different points in time. In those roles, he helped to shape America's trajectory out of the Cold War and into the 21st century. And he did so always putting principle over party. In enacting legislation to establish sanctions on apartheid South Africa, over the opposition of members of his party, including President Reagan, he helped to move South Africa toward a mostly peaceful transition to democracy. He advanced similar legislation and worked assiduously, personally, on assisting in the transition to democracy in the Philippines. He brought Central and Eastern Europe into the European Union and NATO. And imagine how much more unstable the situation in that part of the world would be in countries that face growing nationalism and intolerance internally, as well as military threats from the East externally. Imagine how much more complicated and complex those challenges would be if those countries were not part of the European Union and NATO. And of course, Senator Luger is widely known for making real the once unthinkable idea of the United States partnering with its former adversary, the Soviet Union, and later Russia, to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons in the combustible period that followed the Soviet Union and its dissolution, known widely as the Nunn-Lugar Act. Is John here? John Luger and Riley Luger, Senator Lugar's son and grandson, were here and around, and they have been big supporters of the school and the naming of the school for their dad and granddad. This brings me to the last principle and purpose of this conference that I wanted to discuss, and that is to call attention to the theory of change that these two gentle giants of diplomacy, Congressman Hamilton and Richard Luger, have espoused, which is that change Lasting and sustainable change happens not through division, but through unity, by listening and seeking shared understanding. Unity is the route to deep, lasting, and sustainable change, not division. And that's been the lesson and the example that those two gentlemen provided for us in their great work in the government and since. I'm going to quote one other person. Never were the university's responsibilities for the development of character of greater significance than at the present hour. That's what IU Chancellor Herman Wells said at his first inauguration as president in December 1938. Our circumstances are different today, but we face very serious challenges, and Herman Wells's insight was incredibly important. And I'll end with a quote from Senator Luger, which he said more recently. Growing up in Indiana, one learns early on that talent and accomplishments count, but honesty and integrity count more. Well, in the spirit of Lee Hamilton and Dick Luger, I'm delighted to welcome you to the conference. Looking forward to a great 2 days. Thank you for being here, and thanks again. Of course, we have a hashtag for the conference. It's hashtag ARW 2020, ARW for America's Role in the World, so that we can see your photos and read your coverage. We encourage everybody to tweet. And please copy our Twitter address, which is @Hamilton Lugar. Congressman, how does it feel to be a Twitter address? And now our first panel on climate change in the American public. One of our Hamilton Lugar students will introduce the panel, so allow me to introduce Caroline Duchette, a senior in the Hamilton Lugar School majoring in international studies and Portuguese with a minor in global health promotion. She's passionate about climate change and its impact on public health, and she's had the chance to travel with Professor Jessica O'Reilly, who is on this panel, to the United States Framework Convention on Climate Change last fall to further her research. She looks forward to working as a community health educator in Cameroon with the Peace Corps following graduation in May, and hopes to continue working to connect these passions in the future. Please join me in welcoming Caroline.
Thank you, Dean Feinstein. Good morning, everybody. It's so exciting to see such a full room this morning. As was mentioned, my name is Caroline Duchette. I'm a senior in the Hamilton Lugar School studying Portuguese and International Studies with a minor in Global Health Promotion. As he's mentioned, I'm passionate about climate change and the connection between climate policy and public health, and had the opportunity to travel to the 25th Conference of Parties last fall to observe negotiations on the Paris Agreement and further this interest. In the midst of observing climate activists and protesting and delegates frantically negotiating at the last minute, I was able to complete interviews with experts identifying connections between climate policy and the health outcomes of climate migrants. I hope to continue studying this important topic in the future, but in the meantime, I've accepted a position working as a community health educator in Cameroon with the Peace Corps following graduation, and hope that some of these themes will continue in that work in the future. I'm so excited to be able to present this panel to you today in a moment where climate policy and public engagement in the climate crisis could not be more pressing. Today, we are joined by Isabella Fallahi, an activist and organizer with a youth climate strike, who speaks on the ways the climate crisis affects her health, the livelihoods of marginalized communities, and our future. She is a leader in both the United States and abroad, initiating student-led strikes and initiatives. She recently co-founded Polluters Out, an international climate justice coalition focused on removing fossil fuel industry from all spheres of influence. We're also joined by Vice Admiral Gunn, who served for 35 years in the US Navy. His last active duty assignment was Inspector General of the Department of the Navy. where he was responsible for the department's overall inspection program and its assessments of readiness, training, and quality of service. Jeanette McCabe is a professor of practice at the Indiana University McKinney School of Law and director of the IU Environmental Resilience Institute. From 2013 through 2017, she was acting assistant administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation at the Environmental Protection Agency. Jessica O'Reilly is an environmental anthropologist and professor at the Hamilton Lugar School. She examines how people and ideas in science and policy interact, and how experts make decisions about matters of concern, and how relationships with the environment inform knowledge production. She is also author of The Technocratic Antarctic, an ethnography of scientific expertise and environmental governance. Our moderator, Emily Atkin, is the author and founder of Heated, a daily newsletter dedicated to original accountability reporting and analysis on the climate crisis. Her reporting on climate change has appeared in the New Republic, Slate, and The Hill. She's discussed her climate work on MSNBC, C-SPAN, and NPR. Please join me in welcoming our first panel.
I do this one, and then you guys can, whatever. Yeah.
We're just going to do this.
Yeah. Whatever order you guys want. Hey, everybody. Hi. So I'm Emily Atkin. I will be moderating your panel today. I just want to give you just briefly a little rundown of how this panel is going to work logistically. We have 75 minutes for the panel, and I'm going to talk to our awesome panelists for about 30, 45 minutes, and then we're going to use the rest of the time just for questions from you guys. And if you are going to prioritize questions from students, and hopefully this is just going to be like a really conversational session, and we can get into a lot of different things. Now, when I was first given the title of this panel, which is called Climate Change in the American Public, I was like, oh, you want me to talk about the two broadest, most rapidly changing things in society, like for an hour and 15 minutes. Okay, that's fine. But that is sort of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a problem that changes so rapidly every single year, and with a public whose opinion of that problem changes rapidly every year, whose prioritization of this problem changes every single year. From my own perspective, when I started as a climate journalist in 2013, I saw a listing for a climate reporter job, and I had literally never seen one of those before. And when I told other people, I think I'll go reporting on climate change, people were like, why? And that was 6 years ago. And now we have Isabella on stage today. Isabella was 10 years old when that happened. And I mean, how crazy is that? And when I started writing about climate change, nobody paid attention to me. Nobody cared. It was at the lowest level of every political priority list for Democrats, Republicans, everybody. And that now I cannot keep track of how rapidly it's changing. But one thing that I've learned through covering climate change and through observing how the American public approaches it is that you cannot speak to everybody about this problem, and you cannot solve every part of this problem as an individual, is what I mean. You alone, everyone is here either as a teacher or a student or someone who's interested. You alone have both things are so broad. You alone have a unique way that you can approach this problem, a unique audience that you can speak to, and there's probably a unique part of the climate crisis that you can solve. We need everybody to solve a crisis of this magnitude, but we also need everybody to pick their spots. And so that's why I'm really happy to have this panel here, because we have everybody here from a different spot. We have Isabella sort of not only representing the youth movement, but also representing a perspective of youth activism, and also activism that spans not just the global north, but the global south, and can speak to how other people other youth activists and other activists throughout the world approach this problem. Lee Gunn can speak to the military perspective, which I think is going to be really great. And he can also, we spoke on the phone about some unique experiences speaking to less willing populations who are maybe traditionally don't want to hear about this. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about that. Janet can speak to all of the policy wonkery. Janet was, I don't know if everybody here knows this, but just like at the forefront of creating some of the most important air toxics regulations of the Obama administration. And so we can sort of talk about the policy environment, the regulatory environment, but also the student environment. And Jesse can also speak to that environment as well, but you know, Jesse is a scientist who studies scientists, so, and brings a delegation of students to the UN climate talks every year. And so can speak to that international audience as well as a scientific audience. So I'm hoping that there's something for everybody here. So I'll stop talking. And Isabella, I would love to start with you. I want to go back to that question of prioritization of, you know, my own life. I'm not, I guess, yeah, I'm not that much older than you, but like, you know, my own life is like, I haven't seen this as prioritized by people. And for you, it seems so obvious that this would be a priority. Can you just speak to the perspective of this being your number one priority and where that comes from?
Yeah, so for me, I'm not passionate about climate change. I'm terrified of it. And that's what fuels my work. Nobody's passionate about the end of the future as we know it. And ultimately, when it comes to the rise in youth activism and this political revolution that we're almost having with youth from across the world, is that we are the first generation to see the biggest effects of climate change, but also the last to do literally anything about it. And that's where my perspective comes from, is the sense of urgency that we have. Just sitting in the front, Jessica and I were talking about the IPCC report. And what the IPCC report, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of scientists that come together to basically form an international consensus on where we are at right now in the world with mitigation. But essentially, we have until 2030 to reach real zero and reducing our carbon emissions completely, or else we will be on track to go over 1.5 degrees Celsius. And while that doesn't seem like much, like 1.5, it's not a big number. This has catastrophic effects, in which I'm sure we'll talk more about.
And Lee, maybe you can talk a little more about like the counter. I know we'll get into a lot of stuff, but something I'm really interested in hearing right off the bat is some of the perspective from people who you've spoken to or heard from who don't really see this as a priority. I know coming up in the military, you saw some of that, and I know you've spoken on conservative drive time radio to people. What are you hearing?
Way too frequently. It used to be the case that the military, both in creating readiness, that is, in preparing to do what the American people expected us to do, anticipated that tomorrow would be very much like today. Next year would be very much like this year and last year with regard to the ability to train, the availability of training ranges and their condition, and not only that, but when we were required to operate, we expected that the conditions in which we would have to operate would be very much like what they've always been, and that those conditions affect on the people there would be not substantially different from what it had been in the past. And so we didn't have to figure that dimension into our planning for a military operation, or prior to that, for our planning for preparation for combat operations or humanitarian operations. That world has changed. And so this preamble, Emily, is a little because it's important, I think, that this audience understand that the military now gets it, that the world is changing, and that contributions made by humans are largely responsible for both the change and the rate of change. And that's important in the military because once that's incorporated in the planning documents, once the top level guidance says this is serious, no kidding, we have to be far more resilient in the future than we have been in the past. We have to also expect that it's going to be more difficult to train, that the ranges are going to be closed more often, that the demands domestically for military involvement are going to increase at the same time as humanitarian demands overseas increase as well. The fact that the military now realizes this, and the Military Advisory Board, the 35 retired 3- and 4-star group to which I belong, has understood this and reported on it now a couple of times over the last 15 years, and that we've done several reports that deal directly with energy from a national security perspective, because the need for heavy fuels is something that's very readily apparent throughout the military operations, and the importance of bases and stations and their ability to operate through all sorts of conditions, including large-scale electrical outages and those sorts of things. All of that readiness requirement continues regardless of the availability of those things we've come to depend on. And so the military gets it, and I could talk further about that, but what Emily was referring to was that in addition to our studies that we do at the Military Advisory Board, we've all been on the road. We've been to more than 30 states for the last 15 years, largely focusing on states where the proportion, the preponderance of people do not seem to appreciate the importance of and the impending disaster that we have with regard to climate change. So we spend a lot of time in what have loosely become called as the red states. And we travel for 2 or 3 or 4 days to a place. We go repeatedly to a state. I've been near here in Michigan. I've been a half a dozen times now, and we talk to the legislature, and we talk on the press, video and audio, and we publish op-eds. One amusing incident, kind of when I told the people who were planning my visit to Michigan to fill up my schedule. I was there, I wanted to work. They informed me when I arrived late one night that the next morning my first interview was at 6 o'clock on drive time radio with the conservative broadcaster who covered all of Michigan, and that was followed by a 6:15, a 6:30, a 6:45, and a 7. So the answer was yes, they took me seriously. But the audiences who will listen to those of us who've spent our careers in uniform is often not the same audience who are willing to listen to others whom they believe have some sort of agenda. They correctly assume that we do not. And I've worked with these other 34 now off and on for the last 15 years, and I haven't a clue what the political leaning is of any of them. It's never been part of our conversation.
It's surprising for me to hear that, even the level of optimism about that people are understanding this on sort of a more conservative level, just because of what is currently going on in the Trump administration, which is something I wanted to ask you about, Janet. Just rolling back a lot of regulations about having to do with climate change, not really acknowledging climate change. I mean, how does the way you see the EPA right now, especially, like how does that track with what Leah's saying about how people are starting to understand and starting to get it?
Well, I think that EPA is a little bit at the center of the hurricane in terms of attention from just the bipartisan split and the ideological splits. EPA is mostly made up of career civil servants, many of whom are scientists who are continuing to try to do the work that it's important for them to do. I think dealing with climate change is a team sport, And as you've said, you need all kinds of people contributing their particular expertise. I often get asked, what's the most important thing I can do? And usually the answer I give is vote. And I think that is actually, we need action at all of these levels. We need individual action because even though you recycling one bottle isn't going to make that much of a difference, it creates grassroots awareness and support for these activities and teaches younger generations, of course. But we also need policy at the federal level, at the state level, and where I've focused a lot of my attention lately has been at the local level, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk about that. For those of us that were part of the Obama administration, where we developed things like the Clean Power Plan and the Clean Car Rules, and we really did bring the United States to a position of leadership in the world, and at the Paris talks that was very evident. I sort of vacillate between feeling like I'm being kicked in the gut every day when the news comes out from EPA that this or that rule is now on the chopping block, and trying to take a step back and look at the cycle of history. And of course, things have gone up and down in terms of where policies have been, how aggressive the federal agencies have been. I think what we're seeing now here is that this is we're in an extreme period that people have not seen before, but the world is continuing to move. The climate is continuing to change. People are noticing it more. Mayors are looking over their shoulders at the river coming down, about to create a 500-year flood for the second time in 18 months in their community. Try explaining that to a small town in Indiana where you barely know what a 500-year flood is yourself. And so these things are starting to cascade up, I think, in a way that I don't think is too late, but I think is sort of at a crisis level.
And to sort of wrap up the whole public opinion, how people are approaching this, Jesse, maybe you can talk about a little bit about how I guess scientists are approaching this issue and how they have, maybe their priorities have changed over the last 6 years, and then potentially, if you could get into this, how our perception, the American public's perception of scientists perhaps differs than in other places.
Yep. So there has been a scientific consensus that the climate is changing and that it's anthropogenic or caused by humans since 1978. So this is a long-standing, extremely robust agreement. If you have 97% of experts agreeing on anything, that's an incredibly strong agreement. And that 97% is a conservative estimate. I have met hundreds of climate scientists, and I've never met one that disagrees with this consensus position. So this is a long-standing scientific conversation, and there have been these iterations of reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, that Isabella mentioned. And each time one of these reports is published, about every 6 years, scientists try to find ways to convey to their audiences, to policymakers and to the public, how urgent and serious their findings are. And scientists in general are conservative in their language. They don't want to appear alarmist. They want their words to be backed up with rigorous research and data. And so to see how the scientists have really tried to convey the urgency of our need to act and respond to anthropogenic climate change over the past 40 plus years is academically interesting, but enraging as someone who cares about the environment. Now, the science has really been picked up by most of the world. So when you go to the climate negotiations, unlike in the United States, they don't need to start the negotiations by reproving that the science is real and correct. That's really taken as a given, generally internationally. What's different about the United States is that we have a very well-funded and powerful misinformation lobby that continues to ask people in power to sow seeds of doubt, not even to counter the scientific facts, but just to raise enough questions that we feel like we need to rehash the basics of climate science, reprove it before we can even get to talking about solutions. And frankly, there isn't time. The IPCC report says that we need to act by 2030. And I was talking to some of my science colleagues about that, and they clarified what they mean by that is not to wait 10 years, but to start acting now so that we can be really approaching zero emissions by 2030. There are a couple other countries in the world that do have some climate skepticism, but to see the amount of power that this holds in the United States is really unique to our country.
And that's a really good segue to ask you, Isabella, sort of about Polluters Out, because Polluters Out is the climate justice group that Isabella co-founded, and it's about getting fossil fuel, correct me if I'm wrong, about getting fossil fuel companies sort of out of the climate conversation. And that is an increasing, that's also an increasing goal of a lot of the youth movement and a lot of progressives. So maybe you can talk about a little bit why that is, you know, I was saying earlier, we all are picking spots, right? People say, what can I do? We all pick different spots. Why is that a spot, especially related to misinformation?
So I also attended COP25, and I was this close to getting actually kicked out of the conference for protesting David Hone, who is a Shell executive that was sitting in on negotiations and on panels at climate negotiations, which is, I think we can all agree in this room, a major conflict of interest. And actually, that was what pushed me and my friend Helena Gualinga, who is an indigenous land defender of the Ecuadorian Amazon, to start Polluters Out. Because when we look at banks, when we look at universities, when we look at our governments, our politicians, climate negotiations, and indigenous lands, the fossil fuel industry over decades, and some could even argue centuries through neocolonialism, that they have essentially held a grasp and almost an authoritarian regime over any change that could possibly be made in order to benefit their own corporate interests. Similarly to what Jessica was saying with this misinformation lobby. By show of hands, has anyone in here seen those commercials that show up on TV that Exxon puts on and all these fossil fuel and oil and gas companies saying, come up here, the air is cleaner than ever? Right, it's a lie. That's exactly what Jessica was talking about, and it's ridiculous. And similarly to what other panelists were saying, is that this is more than just putting out misinformation to the public, but it's also using politicians to further their own interests. And that's a big thing that has to do with Polluters Out and our mission, which is to get them removed from all spheres of influence so that we as a society can create progressive change that is absolutely necessary in order to have a sustainable and habitable planet. Essentially, when we look at politicians from both the Democrats and the Republicans, they take fossil fuel money. Nancy Pelosi takes fossil fuel money. Joe Biden's one of his top advisors used to work for an energy company who made millions of dollars. When we look then at the right, Mitch McConnell's an easy one, and so is Donald Trump. And they like to put out that information that you recycling your bottle creates change. It doesn't. In a study by the Carbon Majors report, it said that 71% of carbon emissions since 1988 come from the world's top 100 Fortune 500 companies. Think about that. This issue doesn't start with you or me. We have to really address the issue at its core, which is corporate greed, that is the fossil fuel industry, and the way that they are currently controlling every aspect of power in our society, like JP Morgan Chase, or Harvard University, or even the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I mean, it was absurd that I went to Madrid back in December, and on all these posters around the city saying COP25, UN climate negotiations, next to them in bold was Iberdrola, which is a Spanish oil and gas company which paid millions of dollars to the UNFCCC for a diamond sponsorship of the climate negotiations. We aren't going to get anywhere with change to fit within the IPCC report if the people who caused this crisis are currently calling the shots. And it brings me back to this quote once said by Audre Lorde, which is, "You cannot dismantle the master's house using the master's tools."
Jesse. Well, I wanted to go back to COP25 because I wasn't able to go to Madrid for it, but I had some people who were on the ground there, sort of feeding me pictures and moments of the fossil fuel industry, not only advertising about environmental benefits that they were doing around the COP, but also the influence that they had within the negotiations. And I know you go there every year, and I'm wondering if you could give us more insight onto how the industry is shaping international climate negotiations and what that really means.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tricky problem. The energy companies say that they're energy companies, and solving climate change means reconfiguring their business substantially. And so they say that they have a vested interest as they transition from being fossil fuel energy companies to renewable energy companies. So that's their argument for being there. Do they? I don't know that I have the data to back up how much influence they have. I think that really depends on national delegations. These decisions are made by states, and the influence that oil lobbies or energy executives may have on various state negotiators really depends on a host of things. One thing about the COP, it is the policy negotiations, so they're still working out some of the details of the Paris Agreement, which goes into effect later this year. But it's also full of climate experts from these fossil fuel companies, nuclear experts, indigenous activists, researchers like myself, students, artists, and on and on. And so something that's heartening to see at these COPs is that you can't be a fossil fuel company representative and not get hit back hard by the really robust activism that we're seeing really picking up pace over the past year or two, or maybe three, in response to any attempts to greenwash nuclear energy or coal, which there was a side event a couple of years ago about the environmental benefits of coal. And you can count on immediate sort of complete and total shutdown of the negotiations led by youth and indigenous activists. So people are on it. People like Isabella see this, and I think negotiators are fairly clear-eyed about it as well.
There's a difference, though, between what you see on the outside, though, and what actually happens on the inside, right? I mean,
Right.
There's a difference between shutting down the negotiations and actually, if this was your goal, getting fossil fuel companies out of the negotiations. I mean, I feel like anyone on this panel could speak to the difference between what people say they're going to do and what people aren't going to do. I don't know if either of you guys have any experience that you want to talk about where there's sort of an attempt to do something that doesn't really mobilize. I know in the government it must be super hard to really push forward regulations on these companies, right, Janet?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the regulatory system that we have, everybody has a voice, and there are tools at people's disposal to, I guess I should say, to try to make sure that we move forward conservatively and slowly. So when I was doing regulations, whether it was for the state of Indiana before I went to EPA or at EPA, you have all these stakeholders, and they are working whatever angles they can work, including elected officials, and preparing themselves to challenge your final rule on any one of 1,000 tiny little issues that clever lawyers spend time thinking up. And depending on how proactive and aggressive the political leadership is at the agency, you either don't do very much in response to that or don't do anything, or you try to be as aggressive as you can be, and that's certainly what we tried to do during the Obama administration. In most cases, we're largely successful. We had an extremely good record with the Justice Department in prevailing against challenges brought to our rules. What we're seeing now is putting aside whatever the current political leadership does or doesn't think about climate change, because I just don't really believe whatever people say publicly. But the position coming in of this administration was so anti-regulation, was so responding to this, if I may say in this group, ridiculous notion that there was a war on coal, that the fossil industry needed to be rebuilt and brought back, which every economist pretty much you would read would say was not going to happen because of changes in regulations. That the individual consideration of rules has been overcome by this push, this anti-regulatory push, and that's in response to companies making donations and providing political pressure to those folks, and people feeling that they need to respond to this base of people. I've completely lost track of what your question was by now. I'm really enjoying this. But
yeah, me too.
I think it was like a good response.
All right, I think I'll just cut it right there.
Yeah, it's fine. What I'm saying doesn't matter.
The theme of the conference here is America's role in the world. Another group I belong to, you may not be aware of, is called the U.S. Global Leadership Conference. This is about 400 senior military officers, retired, and senior executives from the Defense Department and business leaders who have come forward to advocate on behalf of development and diplomacy. And so when I go to the Hill and talk about the budget, I don't talk about the defense budget. I talk about development and diplomacy and how important that is, because those of us who've spent, particularly senior folks who've spent our years in uniform, look back on that time as, at least in part, trying to be ambassadors for America. And we feel, particularly in the Navy and the Marine Corps, very close to the Foreign Service. I'm asked when I go out and have these conferences and talk throughout the country about how important it is or isn't that the American government provide solid guidance in the directions that we're talking about here in addressing both mitigating and adapting to climate change. And I talk about some of the things another panelist has mentioned about the activism of mayors, the U.S. Conference of Mayors and governors, and things that we see in various regions around the country. Lots of examples of human energy and innovation and enthusiasm. But it's absolutely the case that U.S. leadership is important, as it has always been important, in leading on, in providing the ideas, but more importantly, the action to support those ideas, in encouraging global movements. It's happened every time there was something important that occurred to humanity since the Second World War. This is the existential time when there's a need for American leadership. And so we argue, without hopefully getting too political, we argue that whatever the next administration looks like, that there has to be a serious leadership from the federal level, not only to take advantage of all of this grassroots developmental work that's being done and the enthusiasm throughout the country, but also to portray America's belief in and reestablish our leadership internationally in getting to the kind of goals that have been agreed to by most other countries. If on the 3rd of November we're actually allowed to withdraw from COP21, from the Paris Agreement, and stay out, it will be a worldwide disaster.
Yeah, and let's be clear about what we're talking about here, because we've talked a lot about, you know, the importance of doing something and how to get to that place and how to convince certain sections of people or talk to certain sections of people, but we haven't actually talked much about why we need to do that and what climate change really means for us individually, for certain populations individually, for Indiana, you know, because we're talking about things that really scare a lot of people, especially talking about the fossil fuel industry and saying, oh, we need to get them out of there. And because we're all like, well, didn't I drive here in a car? Like, oh my God. And so, and you know, you think about the military too. The military, it's like if the military were a country, it'd be the 55th biggest polluter on the planet in greenhouse gases. It'd be like Sweden. And if we go to war, it goes even more. So, you know, why, in your perspective, what do you see as the most concerning impacts of climate change, like the real reasons that make you just say, there is no other option, like we have to do this in 10 years? Isabella, especially when we were talking, I was really struck when you told me about just the different populations that you talk to and engage with. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, you're right. This conference is called America's Role in the World. So now that we just discussed a lot of the corporate lobbying and the influence that the fossil fuel industry has on U.S. politics and establishment alone, we need to think of the international implications in which this holds. The United States is the largest carbon emitter per capita. In addition to that, we're just a major polluter, like you said, with the U.S. military industrial complex. When we further take a look at this and we put it on a scale with the rest of the world, while we continue to, you know, release our emissions, and, you know, Florida will experience hurricanes that are disastrous. Puerto Rico will experience disastrous hurricanes in which we'll provide terrible funding and assistance towards right afterwards. You know, same thing will go for Texas. But when we actually look at the countries that are at the forefront and on the front lines of this crisis, it is predominantly the global south, and it's largely forgotten. When I talk with my friends in Samoa, what they say is that they don't necessarily have the same demands as we do in the U.S., that we want corporate money out of politics, and we want our politicians to reject fossil fuel money. Their demands are much more on an international scale in terms that they want adaptation, but they want reparations for the global south because they have been beaten and exploited in a way that wasn't direct, in a way that was much less direct, and through the United States' continuous deregulation and sort of the wild west of the fossil fuel industry per se, that when these temperatures go up and the sea levels rise, it's not us who is going to feel the first effects, it's Samoa, it's Australia and the bushfires. A girl that I work with, she has a hard time organizing with us because her house burnt down in the recent bushfires. Her whole neighborhood, in fact, is gone. When I talk with my friends in South America, I'm Colombian and Iranian, so I feel the roots and I can really empathize with my friends in the global South, is that when they speak up, social leaders are murdered because of this very similar interest with the mining industry in Colombia. That when indigenous leaders speak up or protect their land, they have rifles pointed in their face. And this isn't just particularly the global South. I also want to call to attention the Wet'suwet'en, who are currently battling the gas-linked pipeline in Canada right now and are currently at a standoff with the RCMP, who are brutalizing the Wet'suwet'en and indigenous youth that are standing in solidarity with them. One of my fellow friends and activists, her name is Cricket Guest, she formed a blockade on a railroad in Toronto to prevent any form of action from the Canadian government to further expand on their project with the gas-linked pipeline. She was carried out, her whole body was, and many indigenous youth faced police brutality, in fact. They were held down to the ground, they were beaten, and this is the reality for a lot of youth around the world, especially youth of color, indigenous youth. BIPOC is what the acronym spells out, Black, Indigenous, People of Color, that when they fight and they speak up in the Global South and in the Global North, they face different repercussions than what I myself as a white passing and arguably white activist face. So I think it's really important that we have to understand the way that the United States overall, especially the US military, and their impacts have in the global climate crisis. I want to also talk about very briefly that as an Iranian, when Qasem Soleimani was killed and Donald Trump threatened a $2 trillion arsenal on the Iranian government, did anyone else look at stocks in oil and gas? Because I did, and they went up. So the two, and the fossil fuel industry and US military and intervention and arguably US exceptionalism are very connected, and that's important to notice, that our actions are more than just the effects that they would have on Iran, the effects that they would have on Samoa, or just policy effects in the way that we interact with Canada, but it has global effects too in worsening this crisis. And it's not going to get any better through, like what Janet said earlier, the slow conservative steps towards zero carbon emissions when we just don't have that time. That those that say that they simply believe in climate change, that does nothing for us in the long run. I don't care if you believe in climate change. What are you actually going to do? Because climate inaction is just as bad as climate denial. We have to be real here, especially when we look at the political sphere as a whole. And ultimately, we have to have climate champions that are leading the US and the world into the future. I have so many friends. I had a friend in Chile who was sending me messages over WhatsApp about how's Super Tuesday going and asking me for election updates and polls and results, and because this has global impacts. If the US is not a part of the Paris Agreement, and the rest of the world is, the rest of the world can progress to cut down their emissions, but you still have one giant evil that is not cutting back their emissions for the sake of their own greed and this false notion that we'll be growing economically. That's a lie, and it's a lie that has been fed to us for decades, when in fact, when the climate fails, we all will go with it. And that includes the US as well.
Can I?
Yeah, I want to give everyone just like a last statement to make, especially just coming off of that theme of really the case that you make especially coming from your own expertise and your own spot in this, that you make to people on why this is such an important issue to focus on. And then I would like to go to questions after that, but we can go and, Jen, did you want to start?
Well, I was just going to add to that speech from a slightly different perspective, which is I think that a lot of people in this country are not in the place where you and your colleagues are. They just aren't. And many people are dealing with the day-to-day struggles of living. And this is, in Indiana especially, where we don't have a coastline and we don't have these things in our face quite so much, it can be hard to get yourself out of your day-to-day life, to realize, to really feel this. But I think that, that even here in Indiana, people are starting to get it, and I wanted to give you a couple examples of things that are being done, one of which is the direct result of Senator Richard Luger, which is that about 10 years ago, I think it was now, when the Waxman-Markey bill had made it through the House and it was maybe going to go to the Senate, Senator Luger went to, the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, and said, hey, you guys, I may have to vote on this bill, and I'd really like to know what the impacts of climate change are in Indiana. Imagine that, doing some research. So they said, oh, of course, Senator Luger, we'd be happy to do that. And he said, great, I need something in 3 weeks. So you know how academics are, right? But they gave him something that sort of looked like a 10th grade, like my 10th grade high school papers. But they decided at that time, we really ought to do a study of what climate change is going to do to Indiana. And they got scientists from IU and Notre Dame and all around the state. And they have been putting out a series of reports. These are scientific, factual reports, not opinion, not suggestions for policy, but scientific reports about the current and future projected impacts of climate change on Indiana. It's called the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment. How many of you in the audience are familiar with it? Okay, so now you all are familiar with it. And I really recommend that you go and look it up. In addition to all the peer-reviewed papers that are produced as part of this, there's a 10 to 12 page report on each of about 10 or 11 topics: tourism and recreation, water quality, forests, energy, public health, all these things that speak really meaningfully to people. And so that's one thing that we have in Indiana now that we didn't have before, and that actually a lot of states don't have. And these are the kinds of conversations and materials you can have with people. When you go to a speech and you have a fact sheet that says, I'll pick another, Jasper County, and it says, according to your own scientists in Indiana, Jasper County has traditionally had 3 days over 95 degrees in the summer. And by 2050, if we're at a medium scenario, which people think will be incredibly challenging to get, you will have 45 days over 95 degrees in the summer in Jasper County. That is really meaningful for people. And I think we need to be operating at that level as well, and getting stories into the local newspaper and on local radio, which partly IU is doing through the Environmental Resilience Institute and the Grand Challenge.
Let me make 3 quick points. First, following on to what Isabella said about America's role in the world explicitly, it seems to me, and to those others in the Military Advisory Board, that if America is allowed to withdraw and stays out of this worldwide compact this fall, that it will excuse polluters around the world, both nations and non-state actors, to say that there's no reason for us to change the ways we live because the Americans haven't. The second point, with regard to bringing the population along, as Janet mentioned, one of the ways that I talk to audiences who, and I refer again to the point that I get in front of audiences who won't listen to others sometime, is I tell them that the young men and women who wear the cloth of the nation in the future are going to experience a different kind of military life than the adults who send them there have become accustomed to. And this is why it's both very important to learn to deal with it and terrifically important that the largest polluter in the world, the US military, the largest single institution polluting in the world, change the way it does business to the maximum extent possible, to the greatest rate possible. And the third thing, when I talk about fossil fuels in comparison with advanced energy, renewable energy primarily, to audiences where there is some economic interest in the future of the United States, and I talk about the importance of American leadership and the worldwide transition to advanced energy, I also say, you know, and this ought to be obvious, but renewable energy doesn't blow up and doesn't burn. And it doesn't come in pipelines that always leak, in spite of the fact that we're told they never leak. So renewables have to have none of those problems. And so this just adds to the bag of reasons that we ought to transition as quickly as possible and lead the transition to advanced energy.
And Jess, you want to give us the last point, and then we'll go to questions?
Yes. Talking about climate change is usually a bit of a downer because it's a major issue, and I watch my students' faces sort of drop over the course of the semester. So I want to talk about what sort of fuels my optimism at the same time that I'm gravely serious about the urgency of the issue ahead of us, and that is seeing our students flourish at the UN meetings, at the UNFCCC meetings. You spoke at the beginning about everybody finding their role. What can you use with your skills, talents, abilities, and interests? And so the IU student delegation to the climate negotiations is mostly Hamilton Lugar students, and as well as from the college and from SPIA O'Neill. And to see everybody working on their projects from health, using their language skills to speak Portuguese with the Brazilian delegation, students interested in advocacy and activism, in science. I see Logan in the back who worked on sort of Arctic melting and indigenous rights. That sort of everybody leaning in from IU and from around the world to figure out, even in the absence of state-level action from the United States, finding ways to move forward, to innovate, to find new solutions, to find new coalitions is really energizing for me, and I really love seeing IU being part of that.
That's a great transition to getting questions from IU students. I don't know exactly how this is going to work. I think there's some microphone situation. I don't know. But I can call on people. Just before we start, we have about 20 minutes for questions. We're prioritizing students, number one. Number two, please make sure you ask a question. If you are just making a statement about something and don't have a question, I will cut you off. That's all. That's all I'm going to do. I'm going to say, what's your question? Anyway, but yeah, let's start it. We have about 20 minutes. See a hand here. You? Yeah. I don't know.
Right there. Yeah.
Oh, that maybe? Oh, there.
Hi, I'm James Romano. I'm a sophomore here at HLS studying East Asian language and culture as well as international law and institutions. My question is directed primarily toward Vice Admiral Gunn concerning potential geopolitical flashpoints as a result of climate change. I know with the receding Arctic, there is the possibility of a Northwest Passage, so I was wondering, Vice Admiral Gunn, if there are geopolitical flashpoints that will occur as a result of climate change, and just your opinion on that.
Sure, I appreciate the question, and it's obviously a relevant one, both for us and for this audience. One of the things that the Military Advisory Board said in the report that we put out in 2007, determining that there was a climate related national security issue was that it was a threat multiplier. That's a term that's become fairly common in the conversation, and I'm glad of that. What we meant was, and what we continue to mean, and we've talked about this again in reports since, is that it's difficult to see how climate change alone, or even one of its effects alone, will by itself create a conflict. It's not at all difficult to understand that almost every area of conflict will be affected by dramatic changes in the environment on which we have depended in order to get where we are in whatever civilization or infrastructure context we're talking about. With regard to the Arctic in particular, that's another whole conversation. The fact is that the Defense Department hopes, and I know the State Department does as well, that the Arctic does not become a scene of conflict, that it becomes a scene of cooperation, as it has been for decades and for centuries. There are lots of problems with an opening Arctic. The Russians intended to exploit that. They built or reinforced 17 military installations along the northern tier in the high north of Russia. They intend to levy it hasn't occurred to me yet how they'll do this, but they intend to levy a fare for supporting the transits across the north. That in itself will not cause a problem. U.S. is not well prepared to operate at sea in the Arctic with a lot of blue water. We're building some Coast Guard cutters, but we're not going to equal the determination of the Russians in that realm either. So I think it's safe to say that during the time we chaired the Arctic Council 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, Secretary Kerry tried to make some advances in that and was successful. And my hope is, I think all of our hope is, that it does not become a scene of conflict.
Behind you, there's a hand.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Wishmeyer, and I'm a junior here at HLS. So my question is for pretty much all of you. So the U.S. in general has developed as a country that's really highly dependent on fossil fuels and oil just for military, for day-to-day life. So how do we balance and transition and create a more sustainable United States that can then go and be a world example?
That's a pretty complicated question. Who wants to start?
Well, a lot of it depends on renewable energy and technological innovation, battery storage, for example. We really need some big breakthroughs. So I hope there's some students out here who are just on the brink of inventing the battery storage that we need and all the other things that we need. Because you're absolutely right, and it's a Navy term that it's really hard to turn a battleship, right? I mean, it's super hard to all of a sudden turn an economy, and we're not all of a sudden turning an economy, but we're starting to slowly turn an economy. I think one of the hard questions is always this tension between, I don't want my life to change at all. It's fine if my electrons are coming from the sun, but I don't want my life to have to change at all. To, our lives are going to have to change. We're going to have to drive less. We're going to have to build our cities differently. We're going to have to think about our food differently. We haven't mentioned food today, but talk about a situation to lead to crises around the world when we can't feed ourselves. So I think, and fortunately we do have more and more renewable energy coming in, and that's going to continue. But it's just going to be really, really hard.
And your life is going to change either way.
Yeah,
I mean,
well, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. If it doesn't change, that's a choice.
Either you control it or you don't control it. But Isabella, I know you had something to add.
So as an activist, I've lobbied on Capitol Hill for the Green New Deal. And before you all either, nod in support or get ready to come after me, depending on what your stance is.
Nobody do
I
that.
think the concept of the Green New Deal really addresses what your concerns are. I mean, we're talking about completely shifting the entire American economic system and all of American society, for that matter, to an economy that's no longer dependent on fossil fuels, but now one that runs and prospers off of renewable energy. That is a whole job sector that we're just opening up. And it's not only just going to stimulate job growth, but at the same time, it's going to lead to better working conditions. People that work in coal mines often experience this condition called black lung or pneumoconiosis. If you're a bio major, you do bio in here, please correct me after this if I said it wrong. But that has a lot of health implications to it. People that live in coal towns and coal families, just in southern Indiana as well, they experience high rates of asthma, COPD, emphysema, all of these health conditions that are a result of inevitable poor working conditions that are automatically associated with their job. And so when we move to renewable energy, we're stimulating job growth and ultimately ensuring the future of this country for our posterity, but at the same time, we're lifting up the working class as well.
If you don't like the Green New Deal, there are a ton of other plans. Like every single Democratic candidate was forced to create a huge sweeping climate plan just because of the demand from voters this cycle. So even though there aren't that many Democratic candidates left, there are a ton of leftover plans that you can look at and decide which one. I would say that there are some Republican plans too, but they're sort of like Republican policies, but not huge plans.
There is one other advantage to your military, even though it is the largest polluter in the world, and that is that all of the bases and stations throughout the world, especially those in the United States, are striving for increased resilience. And not only within the fence line, but within the surrounding community in those areas where the vitals provided by that community need to continue in the face of disruption of other kinds of supplies. And so the military in all of these all these places around the United States is providing an example of a move to renewables. Fort Bliss is going off the grid. With a combination of storage as well as renewables. And so there will be these examples increasingly around the country, I think, that other institutions can begin to follow, and that may be helpful. It's being done not because of the Green New Deal, it's being done to improve mission effectiveness, which is, by the way, the only argument that holds sway in the Congress.
There's a hand back there. White shirt, maybe? White, blue?
Hi, my name's Maria, and I'm actually creating my own major in food security and global business, so you kind of beat me to the chase with that. But as much of America and the world relies on agriculture in the global south, how have each of you in your own disciplines seen the threat of food and especially water insecurity affect people around the world, and how do you see America's role in sort of changing that?
Who would like to start? Anybody?
Why not? I spent more than I would like to talk about of my early Navy career in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War and later. There is not sufficient conversation. As Janet said, we haven't talked about food security. It's a great question. We talk about the myriad effects of sea level rise in important places around the world. Southeast Asia is not exactly the world south, but it's pretty south. And the fact is that the Mekong Delta, for example, is the rice basket for arguably 1 billion or 1.5 billion people. And there are piers in Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, that are about 6 feet above the current sea level. And the current seas are 100 miles away. And so a change in sea level will have a fairly immediate effect on a very important part of the food supply of a very large part of the world population. And it's going to be evident in that way around the world in areas we don't expect. When you're done with your major, you need to tell us where those primary effects will be.
I'll just add that at the COP, there are a lot of agro-industry companies who attend, and their climate resilience plans tend to be some of the most advanced corporate climate action plans because they're so aware of this really global supply chain in food. So things like chocolate and coffee and sugar. They're seeing the changes now in tropical regions and having to adjust now. So it's an excellent major to design, Maria.
Did you want to add something, or we can?
I think the Admiral said it pretty well, but basically, in a lot of my work, I focus on people issues and the fact that climate change is more than just effects on the environment and the natural world, and constantly throwing numbers at people isn't always the best way to portray the message to individuals. I believe in the power of storytelling, so I'm going to tell a little story to answer your question. So the climate is, getting progressively worse, and global temperatures are rising. With that, we're seeing soil becoming depleted. We're seeing oftentimes land that used to be fertile now no longer being able to grow basic crops that can sustain a community in the global south. One that was even their economy and a large source of their income as well. Then we look at the Amazon, and we see the actions in which Jair Bolsonaro is depleting the Amazon rainforest, which is taking away a lot of natural resources and which are necessary for us that we thrive off of, food that makes it onto our plates. But at the same time, those trees are crucial to removing CO2 from the air. And while he's taking away those trees and those natural resources in which the land defenders are protecting, that is their human right to do and their right held by their indigenous human rights by the United Nations, and they're being completely violated, those same land defenders are being killed to make way for big agricultural industries as well that are trying to emerge. But at the same time, they're undercutting small farmers that are producing meat and products that we eat on a daily basis, but more in a sustainable fashion. So ultimately, the climate crisis is going to change the way that we get our food, whether it is we have less of it and we have to ration it in the worst possible case, or we have sustainable, healthy food, and in the process of moving to renewable energy, we lift up everyone, including the global south, like you were discussing, and their economies as well.
We have time for either 2 quick ones or 1 longer one, so it's up to you. I'm going to go on this side of the room. I'll go for you.
I don't need a mic.
Oh.
Sorry. Trying to save time. Hi, I'm Randy. I'm a MPA student over at O'Neill. My question is regarding the U.S. military and this international panels. If the military is recognized as the U.S. military and is the 55th worst polluter, but there's other countries that benefit from the U.S. military and our ability to respond, is it a fair way to frame the argument that it's the U.S. footprint, and if it is fair or if it isn't fair, depending on your answer, are there any trade-offs that the international community is willing to make, considering that would reduce our supply chain and response capabilities, presumably?
That's a really interesting question. Real quick answer. I don't think that the U.S. military is any place in the world representing anything other than the interests of the American people. It is, in my view, as somebody who did this for 35 years plus, it is only the interests of the American people that determines where we go and largely what we do. And with regard to reducing the pollution, in addition to those things I mentioned about bases and stations, there are lots of other changes that are underway. Every military aircraft in the U.S. has been qualified to run on a mix of biofuels as well as avgas. And that's increasing. As a matter of fact, there was congressional criticism of the United States Navy for qualifying its aircraft to fly on flex fuels, essentially. And it was sort of portrayed as a chemistry experiment to build a market. It was, in fact, so the military would have the flexibility to use whatever they find wherever we go.
All right, I got time for another one. Over there? You? Yes. No, you, yeah.
Hi, my name is Maura. I'm a senior here. I'm over in SPIA, Law and Public Policy. We've spoken a lot about how climate change affects marginalized communities more than it affects others. And I see that being prioritized in the activism that I see in the climate change sphere. Do you see that being prioritized in the policies that are being put out as well?
Well, I can respond on behalf of the communities here in Indiana that there are some of them that have stepped up to develop climate plans. And Indianapolis, for example, South Bend, Bloomington are explicitly focusing on equity and social justice and building that in very much into their plans. And I think the fact that maybe we're in Indiana and so people are not as comfortable just being super explicit about this is a climate change plan and we're going to reduce CO2, it allows them to bring in other concepts. And as Isabella said, everything that we do to reduce greenhouse gases has other benefits in terms of immediate pollution reduction that causes public health problems inequitably. So there's lots of arguments to be made. But I'm very pleased at seeing these local governments see that they have to include social equity as part of their planning to address the problem.
To add to that, the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees gives a really solid scientific basis about policy options to hold warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius in comparison with 2 degrees Celsius, which for a long time was the gold standard for what sort of the global community wanted to keep warming levels at. And that does, when you compare just that ½ degree Celsius, you do see a range of impacts, benefits or negative impacts on marginalized communities and marginal environments. And so there are careful policy considerations from the scientific community there. Also, an article in the Paris Agreement, Article 8, is loss and damage, and that's about addressing communities whose entire sort of sovereign territory, like Pacific Islands, are going to be wiped out by sea level rise. So there are mechanisms in place, but the question is, what is the will and ambition behind those to really put them into action?
Isabella, you can have the last word.
Yeah. So just within my own activism, definitely I do see a lot of the way that marginalized communities, frontline communities, and activists of color are they're often left out by a lot of the media narrative, but they're there, and they're by far the most powerful people in this movement that go largely underrepresented and acknowledged. But when we look at the astounding Paris Agreement that is been, for the large part on this panel, portrayed as, something that's so amazing and perfect, there are criticisms to it. Article 6, which is how we get to solve the climate crisis. It's all about mitigation and carbon markets, but there's been a huge movement recently among Indigenous activists to add Indigenous rights within Article 6 so that when we do go towards mitigating the climate crisis, we're not going to disregard Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty like we have with pipelines in the past and as we move forward for renewable energy. I believe that climate justice, you can't have climate justice without racial justice. And this is best seen in the way that we look at who is predominantly impacted. In California, there are oftentimes oil reserves that are built only a mere hundreds of feet away from communities of color and low-income communities, and which then in turn lack the social mobility in order to counteract a lot of the health effects that they face disproportionately. And those are oftentimes systemic causes from redlining and Jim Crow laws that we still see effects of today. But ultimately, if we want to solve the climate crisis, we have to take into account providing equity for communities of color around the world.
We are a little over, so I kind of have to leave it there. Actually, I'm going to leave it on the point that participating is very important, especially since so much of the youth movement can't actually participate in democracy. Just a reminder that Isabella can't vote. She's not old enough to vote. So participation is important. Thank you for participating in this. Thank you for being here. And please give our panelists a round of applause.